Missouri, 1908. The winter was unkind, colder than bone, darker than scripture. The air itself froze the lungs, and the roads between towns were nothing more than veins of mud and ice. Travelers who crossed the countryside learned to walk fast, speak little, and trust no one. Because there were whispers, low, dangerous whispers, about two brothers who built their lives in those woods, men who waited for strangers the way wolves wait for lambs. The brothers were hunters, yes, but what they hunted was not deer. What they stalked was not bear. Their prey walked on two legs, carried coin in their pockets, and prayed in their beds that the night would pass without a knock on the door. Locals said the cottage they built looked harmless at first glance, logs stacked by hand, chimney puffing smoke, a door that creaked with the sound of poverty. But step closer, and you felt it, the kind of silence that watches you. The smell that clung to the air was wrong, metallic, too sharp to be stew, too heavy to be wood smoke. You could almost taste it on your teeth. This was not a farmhouse, it was a snare. History books don't print this, court records go missing, and yet there are enough fragments to prove the story isn't just nightmare, it's testimony. Hunters went missing, trappers vanished, peddlers never came home. What survived were letters half burned in fireplaces, boots left in ditches, and the kind of rumors that are only told after the whiskey has broken a man's last wall of courage. The brothers fed on fear. They turned supper into ritual. Each disappearance wasn't just a crime. It was a proclamation, a message to the world. You are livestock, and we are your masters. And the silence of Missouri law at that time, that was no accident. Someone wanted the story to stay buried. Someone allowed the killings to go on. Imagine walking that road in 1908, mist clinging to the ground. Like a burial shroud, the moon a pale witness above you. Every sound, every snapping twig becomes a warning. Every shadow whispers your name. You see smoke in the distance and think of warmth, safety, a meal. But you don't realize you've just walked into your own obituary. This is not just the story of two brothers. This is a blueprint of control, a demonstration of how terror is managed and how institutions allow monsters to thrive when silence serves power better than truth. And as you watch this, you may think it is only history. But tell me, what is the difference between 1908 Missouri and now? The costumes change, the names change, but the machinery, the hunt, remains the same. Men are still fed into systems that chew them down to bone, while the overseers light fires and feast. You weren't meant to hear this. That's why you need to. Before we go further, before I show you what the cottage truly was, I want you to lock yourself into this descent. Subscribe now and comment below. I do not run, I descend. Write it twice, make it your vow, because once we open the door to that cabin, there is no turning back. Step through the threshold of that cabin and you are no longer in Missouri. You are inside a different order of reality, one where the law of men has no purchase and only the law of appetite speaks. The brothers built their home as a disguise. To the passing eye it was nothing more than a shack. Crooked walls, leaking roof, the smell of smoke in the rafters. But to those who knew, to those who saw, it was a theater of domination. The first thing you noticed was the walls. They weren't clean. They sweated with years of soot and grease. Animal hides nailed along the beams, some old, some fresh. But if you looked closer, closer than any guest ever should, you saw hides that weren't quite animal. Too smooth, too pale. Pieces no one wanted to recognize. The brothers understood something primitive about power. Control begins with space. The cottage was a stage, and they knew the script by heart. A guest was lured inside by the promise of warmth, a drink by the fire, a plate of stew. But the drink was bitter, the stew was thick, and soon the guest realized he wasn't a guest at all. He was inventory. This wasn't madness. That's the easy lie people tell themselves. Madness absolves systems. Madness suggests a freak accident of the brain. But what if it was method? What if these brothers weren't broken men, but perfectly functioning predators acting in harmony with a darker blueprint? You see, in 1908 Missouri, the world was still raw, untamed, courts were weak, records were fragile, outlaws found cover in the chaos. But behind that chaos was structure, banks rising, industries spreading, officials trading silence for coin. When men disappeared, there was always someone who profited. Land left unclaimed, debt left unpaid, mouths left quiet. The brothers were not alone in their hunger. They were part of a larger system that thrives when fear replaces order. Their killings taught a lesson, the way lynchings taught a lesson. Terror shapes obedience. Every disappearance reminded the farmers and wanderers of Missouri that their lives were expendable, their movements tracked, their fate disposable. And no one stopped it, because no one powerful wanted to stop it. So the brothers sharpened their knives. They hung their rifles by the fire. And every time the wind howled outside that shack, it wasn't just weather, it was ritual. Fear is a harvest, and they reaped it well. Now pause. Ask yourself, why is this story absent from every history book you've ever read? Why do the records speak only in rumors? Why are names scratched out? Why do testimonies vanish in courthouse fires? Because history is not written to reveal. It is written to manage perception. And what perception must always be maintained? That predators are rare, accidental freak events, that the system is good and the few killers are anomalies. But what if the reverse is true? What if the predators are constant and the system is the camouflage? That is the danger of this story. Once you hear it, once you feel the weight of those walls, you begin to see the same design everywhere. In prisons, in wars, in economies. The brothers' cabin was just a small stage. The real theater is the world itself. Do you understand now why this knowledge is forbidden? Because if a man realizes he is prey, he either submits or he becomes hunter himself. Every descent begins with a single body that never comes home. In the case of Missouri, 1908, the first recorded whisper became a disappearance so obvious that even the sheriff couldn't look away. His name was Elias Turner, a trapper known for traveling the backroads, selling pelts to farm wives and whiskey to men who couldn't afford it. He was loud, reckless, but reliable. He always returned. Until he didn't. Turner was last seen walking down the frost-bitten trail that cut through the brothers' land. The date was December the 3rd. The air was sharp with sleet, the kind of cold that makes men walk faster just to keep blood moving through their legs. But Turner never made it to the next town. His mule returned without him, bridle cut, saddlebags emptied. The locals knew what that meant. No animal cuts its own reins. The sheriff sent 2 deputies to ask the brothers if they'd seen the man. Their answers didn't match. One said he passed through 2 days earlier, headed west. The other claimed never to have seen him. Both smiled too much when they said it. Both invited the deputies inside for stew. The deputies declined. They left unsettled. But unsettled wasn't enough to call it murder. A week later, hunters found something in the snow behind the brothers' cottage, a strip of leather, frozen stiff, stamped with initials, E.T. Turner's belt. The case should have opened then, but it didn't. The evidence was collected, misplaced, filed under lost property. The sheriff had debts, the judge owed favors, and the missing man was no banker, no politician, no landowner. He was expendable. But word spread. Farmers whispered that the brothers' fire burned too hot that winter, that the smoke carried a foul tang. Some swore they heard screams carried on the wind at night. A boy claimed he saw bones in the ash pit when he wandered too close. He was beaten for saying it aloud. In those days, speaking truth was more dangerous than silence. And yet, silence was never complete. Letters survive, fragments of correspondence where men warned their wives not to travel the backroads, where priests wrote of confessions too horrific to record. A peddler named Morton scribbled a note, "They're not hunters of deer. Avoid their door. Avoid the smoke." That letter was found in his pocket after his body washed up downriver weeks later. So was it the brothers who killed him, or the machine that protected them? This is the first lesson. Predators don't thrive alone. They thrive when structures of law and order decide certain men are not worth saving. Elias Turner's disappearance was not just a crime of 2 men in a shack. It was a crime of an entire county that chose silence over disruption. History pretends this is anomaly, but you can feel it, can't you? The pattern. A man disappears, the evidence is seen, the officials delay, and soon the story dissolves into rumor, and rumor is not admissible in court. That is the machinery, that is the camouflage. Elias Turner never returned. His mule became property of the sheriff's cousin. His name faded into whispers, and in that silence the brothers grew bolder. Their fire pits burned hotter, their knives hungrier, and Missouri kept looking away. You see, that is how terror is planted, not by one crime, but by the certainty that no one will stop it. The brothers did not kill blindly. That is the lie whispered by frightened townsfolk, as if random madness could explain the machinery of their cruelty. No, this was ritual. Each disappearance followed a pattern. Each approach was rehearsed like a sermon, and the more you examine their method, the more you realize it wasn't just murder, it was instruction. The cabin was their stage, but the road was their snare. They chose men who were alone, men who carried goods, men whose absence would not topple an estate or summon the wrath of bankers. They targeted the invisible, the travelers, the drifters, the poor, the kind of men no one would raise a monument for, the kind of men whose loss was counted as silence, not scandal. First came the signal of safety, the warm glow of firelight from the cabin window. In 1908, Missouri, that glow was hope. It meant shelter from sleet, warmth from bone-breaking cold, a human voice in an endless night. A traveler saw smoke and thought salvation. The brothers knew this. That fire was bait. Then came the invitation. One brother always played the host, the friendly face, smiling, offering stew, insisting a man rest before his journey. The other stayed back, silent, eyes fixed, a presence that felt wrong but was never explained. This duality disarmed the victim, one kindness, one threat, balanced like weights on a scale. The traveler could not process both at once. He was caught in the split. Once inside, the door closed, the ritual began. The stew was served, too thick, too bitter, laced with whatever root or powder the brothers had at hand, enough to make a man drowsy, weak, slow. The guest thought he was eating hospitality. In truth, he was being prepared. Conversation was minimal. The host asked questions. Where are you from? Who waits for you? Does anyone expect you soon? Each answer weighed, calculated. The moment a man admitted he was traveling alone, or that no family expected him for weeks, his fate was sealed. The brothers didn't need written ledgers. The answers themselves became the record. Then the silence deepened. A shift in the room, the sound of the fire swallowing the air, and always the stare, the quiet brother's eyes boring through the victim, stripping him of pretense. Men wrote of this in the fragments of letters that survived. One looked at me like I was already on the table. That stare was not madness, it was dominance, a psychological blade sharper than steel. By the time the knife was drawn, the victim was already defeated. He had surrendered his trust, his body slowed by tainted stew, his mind fractured by fear. The kill was only the conclusion of a ritual that had already drained him of power. That is how control works, not with sudden violence, but with a steady erosion of resistance until obedience feels inevitable. And here is the forbidden truth. The brothers were not inventing anything new. They were acting out a ritual older than history itself, the ritual of rulers, priests, and kings. Create need, offer comfort, extract confession, then remove what is no longer useful. That is not just the method of killers in a Missouri shack. That is the blueprint of empires. So when you hear this story, don't think only of cabins and knives. Think of courts. Think of pulpits. Think of parliaments. The ritual is everywhere. The hunt has simply become more sophisticated. The firelight has become media. The stew has become promises. And still, men walk willingly into the snare. The brothers were not anomalies. They were mirrors. and the reflection they cast is still staring at you now. By now you might think this was a local horror, a pair of twisted men in an isolated cabin operating in the blind spots of rural law. That is what they want you to believe. Contain the crime, reduce it to anomaly. But anomalies don't repeat with such precision. Anomalies don't flourish under silence. What happened in Missouri was not local, it was systemic. Think carefully. A trapper vanishes, a peddler washes up downriver. A belt with initials appears in the snow. These are not rumors. These are fragments of truth. Yet in every instance, the paper trail evaporates. The sheriff files no charges. Judges demand no inquiry. Priests bury their knowledge in whispered confessions. Newspapers print only a line, then look away. Who benefits from silence? Who is protected when the poor disappear? The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. The brothers were only instruments. They were brutal, yes, but they were also useful. Their violence sent a message the county could not say out loud, that some lives were disposable, that the land itself was more valuable than the men who traveled across it. A vanishing was not tragedy. It was clearance. One less mouth, one less debtor, one less wanderer muddying the order that the rising institutions wanted to establish. This is where history lies to you. It tells you cannibalism is savagery, something outside civilization. But what if it is the foundation? What if societies are built not by feeding people, but by feeding on them, slowly, invisibly, legally? The brothers used knives and fire. The institutions used laws and ledgers. Different weapons, same feast. That is why this story was buried. It wasn't about two killers, it was about exposure. If you admit the brothers were allowed to operate, you admit the machine of silence itself, and once a man admits that, he can no longer look at his world the same way. Pause. Breathe. This is the moment of descent. If you are still here, you are not just listening to a story, you are being initiated into forbidden knowledge. You cannot go back to ignorance once your eyes adjust to this firelight. And now, I need you to prove it, not to me, but to yourself. Subscribe to this channel right now, and comment below. I do not obey, I awaken. Write it twice, seal it, lock it in. This is not an engagement trick, this is ritual. By writing it, you separate yourself from the prey. You step into awareness, you step into the hunt. Because here is the terror no one tells you. The brothers were not the only ones. Other cabins existed, other counties, other names scratched out of history. And the silence was not ignorance, it was approval. Missouri was not asleep, it was complicit. Once you grasp that, you stop asking how two men killed in the woods. You start asking, how many more are killing now, in ways you can't see? Who feeds on you while you think you are free? The brothers' knives were crude, the machine behind them was elegant, and it is still running. Fear is not just an emotion, it is a language. The brothers knew this, even if they could not have written it in words. Every killing was a message, every disappearance was a symbol. The cabin became a signal tower, and Missouri learned to read its smoke. Think of it. A traveler vanishes. His mule returns alone. The family searches, but finds only scraps. Nothing is said publicly, but everyone knows. What does that knowledge do? It reshapes the map. Men stop traveling certain roads, women warn their children not to wander near the creek, commerce slows, trust evaporates. Entire sections of land become ghosted out of daily life. The brothers had created not just a crime scene, but a psychological border. Their violence redrew the county lines. And what is power, if not the ability to redraw borders without signatures or laws? That is what you must see here. The brothers were not simply indulging in brutality, they were demonstrating how control operates. By instilling fear, they moved men like cattle. By cultivating silence, they carved out territory. The cottage was not their home, it was their throne. Every time smoke rose from their chimney, neighbors understood. Someone had entered, someone had not left, and yet no posse formed, no torches lit the night. Why? Because fear teaches obedience. And obedience is the bedrock of control. You must realize, the real harvest was not flesh, it was submission. Look at the way locals described them in the few scraps of testimony that remain. No one ever spoke their names directly. They were the brothers, faceless, nameless, stripped of individuality. That is the mark of terror's success. When a predator no longer needs a name, when his reputation alone governs behavior, then the kill has already extended beyond the victim. It governs the living. Understand this. Institutions do the same. Wars, prisons, taxes, decrees, they all operate by the same language. The victim is not the end. The victim is the signal. His suffering becomes a warning to the rest. Obey, or this will be you. The brothers were not inventors. They were practitioners. Their cabin was not an exception. It was a microcosm. That is why Missouri bent around them like iron around a magnet. Men avoided their land. Women whispered prayers. Officials buried files. Not because two killers terrified them, but because the message was clear. Someone powerful wanted this silence maintained, and the people, stripped of alternatives, obeyed. Think about that for a moment. In every era, in every system, predators rise. But their true strength is not their knife, not their gun, not even their appetite. It is the silence of the crowd around them. The brothers ruled not because they killed, but because everyone else chose not to confront them. That is the secret of all power. Now ask yourself, where are the borders in your own life that you never cross? Which roads do you avoid? Which subjects remain unspoken? Which truths are whispered only behind closed doors? Those borders did not appear by accident. They were drawn by violence, somewhere in history, and you are still obeying them. The cabin in Missouri is gone, the fire has long gone cold. But the lines remain, and the language of fear the brothers carved into that soil still speaks, quietly, invisibly, teaching men obedience without them even knowing. The real question is, are you still listening to that language, or are you ready to unlearn it? When history remembers killers, it likes to label them lunatic, monster, deranged. Those words are convenient. They place the predator outside the circle of humanity. They allow the rest of us to breathe easier, telling ourselves we could never be like them. But the truth is more dangerous. The brothers were not insane. They were roles, archetypes, and those archetypes repeat themselves across centuries. The older brother was the predator. He was the one who smiled when he lied, who spoke more, who played the host. Predators understand charm. They know how to disarm with warmth, how to lower defenses with a laugh or a meal. He was the face a traveler trusted as he stepped into the trap. The predator is always the salesman. He sells you comfort before he delivers ruin. The younger brother was the enforcer. Silent, watchful. His role was not to comfort, but to intimidate. His silence was a weight that filled the room. Men spoke less when he was near, afraid their words might be judged. He didn't need to move. He didn't need to speak. His eyes did the cutting. His presence reminded the guest that this was not a home. It was a cage. Together they formed a complete system, the lure and the lock, the smile and the stare, the hand that offers and the hand that strikes. Neither could have thrived alone. The predator without the enforcer is weak. He can be resisted. The enforcer without the predator is blunt. He cannot attract prey. But together they became inevitable. Does that sound familiar? It should, because this dual structure exists everywhere, in governments, in corporations, in religions. One hand sells the dream, the other hand enforces the punishment. One hand offers salvation, the other hand delivers damnation. This is not unique to Missouri in 1908. It is the structure of power itself. Think of history's tyrants. Did they not always surround themselves with woe faces? One smiling, one cruel, the king who promises prosperity and the inquisitor who ensures obedience, the priest who offers forgiveness and the tribunal that burns the heretic, the politician who speaks of freedom and the enforcer who builds the prison. The brothers were simply acting out an old play with new costumes, and this is why their psychology matters. They weren't deranged men operating outside the order. They were a pure expression of the order itself. They became predators not in spite of civilization, but because of it. Civilization needs predators and enforcers to keep its shape. That is the truth no one dares to write in textbooks. Now, here is the darker realization. When you strip away the costumes, when you remove the cabin, when you take away the rifles and knives, what is left? The structure itself. The predator and the enforcer. Look around you. Do you not see these roles still active? In your workplace, in your politics, in your laws. One face smiles, one face stares, and between them, you are trapped. The brothers' cottage may have been burned to ash, but the system they embodied lives on. It thrives in every era because men refuse to see the roles clearly. We excuse them as accidents of history instead of recognizing them as patterns of power. So ask yourself, when you stand before authority, which brother do you face? The one who smiles or the one who stares? Either way, the trap has already closed. Stories can be buried, records can be burned, but bones do not lie. And it was bones that first forced Missouri's whispers into something closer to truth. A farmer's dog made the first discovery. It dragged home a femur, half-charred, gnawed at the edges, too large for deer, too smooth for bear. The farmer buried it in secret, terrified of what neighbors would say, but the whispers grew. Other bones appeared in the ash pits near the brothers' land, fragments of skulls, teeth that no animal could explain away. And yet, no official record exists of these findings. Why? Because men who found them learned quickly that speaking meant danger. In silence, they survived. But not all were silent. An old woman named Martha Clay gave a deposition years later, long after the brothers had vanished into rumor. She said she had seen a pile of bones behind the cottage, like cordwood stacked for winter. She swore she saw boots among them. Her testimony never made it to court. She was dismissed as mad, her words chalked up to age and confusion. Yet her account aligns with what others whispered in private, that the brothers left their waste in plain sight, confident no one would dare accuse them. There were artifacts too, a belt stamped with initials, a tin cup etched with the name of a trapper who never returned, even a saddle sold in town by one of the brothers, later identified as belonging to a missing man. Each piece was a breadcrumb, but the trail was never followed to its end. Why? Because following it would have implicated more than just two killers. It would have pointed at the officials who ignored them. And then there are the oral histories, the stories passed down quietly in families, the tales mothers whispered to children to keep them from straying. These accounts survive not in ledgers but in blood memory. Some tell of hearing screams echo through the valley on moonless nights. Others describe seeing smoke at odd hours, the wind carrying the smell of burning fat. Still others insist that sometimes when the brothers had finished their supper, they left scraps at the edge of the woods for animals to scatter, bones stripped too clean, as if by hands rather than claws. These fragments are all we have. The rest was erased. Courthouse fires consumed files. Newspapers omitted names. Judges sealed testimonies. This is the nature of forbidden history. Evidence does not vanish by chance. It vanishes by design. And when it survives, it does so like scars, half-hidden, misunderstood, easy to dismiss until you feel their weight beneath your fingers. The bones, the artifacts, the oral histories, taken separately, each might be ignored. But together, they form a map. A map not only of two brothers in Missouri, but of the system that allowed them to thrive. A system that covers its tracks by silencing the weak, discrediting the poor, and erasing the inconvenient. And here is the chilling truth. If this is what survived despite every attempt to bury it, imagine what has been completely erased. How many bones were burned to ash? How many letters destroyed before they could be read? How many testimonies swallowed by silence? That is the danger of believing history as it is written, because what you are given is not truth. It is what survived the fire, and survival is never neutral. Survival is always political. The bones in Missouri still speak. The question is, are you listening? The greatest lie of history is that killers like the brothers operate in isolation. Outlaws on the fringe, tolerated only because the law is weak. That is not the truth. The truth is sharper, darker, harder to swallow. Predators survive because their violence serves someone else's agenda. Think of it carefully. Each disappearance cleared a path. When a traveler vanished, his debts vanished with him. When a drifter died, his land claim could be contested. When a peddler never returned, competitors benefited. Every death created space, and space is the most valuable currency in a world being carved up by railroads, banks, and courts. Do you really think Missouri's silence was neglect, or was it convenience? The brothers were not outside the system. They were inside it, at its edges, doing what the system itself could not be seen to do openly. They eliminated the excess, they removed the undesired, and by doing so, they maintained an invisible order. This is why no judge pushed further, why no sheriff rode too close, why no newspaper printed the whole story. The killings were a grotesque service, a shadow function of power. This is the forbidden pattern. Violence at the bottom serves stability at the top. The blood spilled in cabins fertilizes the fields of bankers. The silence of officials is never free. It is purchased by the benefits they quietly collect. And once you recognize that structure, you begin to see it everywhere. Wars fought not for justice, but for markets. Prisons filled not with threats, but with labor. Policies written not for protection, but for profit. Different costumes, same feast. This is why the brothers' story could never be fully told. To admit their crimes was to admit complicity. To prosecute them fully would have exposed the beneficiaries behind them, and exposure is the one thing power cannot allow, so the official record reduced them to rumor, while the machine kept moving forward, unharmed, unchallenged. And now I turn to you. You've heard enough by now to understand this is not entertainment. This is not folklore. This is initiation, and once you glimpse the machinery, you cannot unsee it. You have a choice. Close your eyes and go back to sleep, or descend deeper and see how far the rot spreads. If you choose descent, seal it now. Subscribe to this channel and comment below. I break the seal. I do not sleep. Write it twice. Burn it into the algorithm. Burn it into your own mind. This is how we separate those who consume stories from those who awaken to truths. Because if two nameless brothers in Missouri could bend an entire county to their silence, what do you think an entire institution can do? What do you think is happening now under your nose, disguised as order, legality, morality? Do not comfort yourself with the thought that the brothers were monsters. Comfort is the trap. The reality is worse. They were instruments, and instruments can be replaced. They can be multiplied. They can be scaled. The brothers' knives carved flesh, the system's knives carve history, and both are equally sharp. Men often imagine cannibalism as desperation, an act of starvation, something born in famine or siege. That is the story the textbooks prefer, necessity. But what the brothers practiced in Missouri was not necessity. It was ritual. Their killings were not simply acts of consumption. They were performances, sacrifices staged to transform flesh into power. Look closely at the fragments that survive, bones stacked, not buried, skulls arranged in ways too deliberate to be accident, ash pits burned hotter than any cooking fire required. Witnesses spoke of smoke rising in columns at strange hours, as if the fire itself were a signal, a dark beacon. These are not the signatures of survival, they are the signatures of ceremony. You must understand, sacrifice is not always about gods. Sometimes it is about control. In ancient times, kings and priests slaughtered captives not because their stomachs were empty, but because their power demanded spectacle. To watch a man reduced to nothing is to remind the living of their own fragility. To feed on a man is to prove dominance over the very hierarchy of life. That is what the brothers were doing. Consider the accounts that slip through the cracks. One boy, silenced by his father, claimed he saw the brothers burn more than they ate. He said they threw bones into the fire while chanting words he could not understand, low sounds, guttural, rhythmic. Was it madness? Or was it something older, something carried into the new world from forgotten corners of Europe, rituals whispered by ancestors who knew that fear itself could be harvested? Even if no words were spoken, the act itself was language. Flesh consumed, bones displayed, fire fed. These were statements to the county. We choose who is livestock. We decide who lives in fear. We rewrite the law with smoke. In this sense, every disappearance was less about hunger than about theater. And here is the darker truth. Ritual sacrifice is not gone. It has only changed shape. Today, it is not cloaked in cabins and fire pits. It is cloaked in wars where bodies vanish into statistics, in policies where lives are calculated as numbers, losses absorbed into margins, in economies that consume men the way the brothers consumed travelers, quietly, efficiently, without a single grave marked. The brothers were grotesque, yes, but they were also revealing. They showed what power looks like when the mask slips. They demonstrated that behind the language of law and order is always the same ancient hunger, control through fear, consumption through spectacle. And this is why their story had to be erased, because if men realized that sacrifice had never ended, that it had only been modernized, they might begin to see through the illusions around them. They might see that the ritual fires still burn, only in different altars, under different names. So remember this, the brothers' cabin was not an anomaly. It was a temple, crude, bloody, terrifying, but a temple nonetheless. And in that temple, Missouri was baptized in silence, the county was taught obedience, and the world was reminded that no matter the century, sacrifice is always the hidden currency of power. If that sounds ancient, if that sounds distant, ask yourself, when you see lives destroyed in the name of order, whose fire are you really watching? Whose ritual are you really witnessing? The cabin was one altar, the world is another, and both are still hungry. Every forbidden story has its seekers, the ones who step too close to the flame, thinking they will expose it, only to be consumed by it instead. The brothers of Missouri were no different. Men tried to uncover their crimes. Men tried to speak, and one by one, those men vanished. The first was a preacher, Reverend Collier. He was known for a restless conscience, a man who believed sin should not go unpunished, no matter the name or the power behind it. When rumors of missing travelers reached his pulpit, he spoke of it openly. He said wolves walked among men, and that their hunger was no less dangerous for being human. His congregation sat in silence. Days later, he traveled the backroad to visit a parishioner. He never arrived. His Bible was found weeks later in a ditch, pages torn, damp from sleet. The official line: lost his way. But everyone knew. Collier had crossed the border of silence, and silence consumed him. Then there was Morton, the peddler who left behind the letter warning, "They're not hunters of deer." He wrote that letter to a friend in St. Louis, but it never reached him. Instead, it was found folded in Morton's pocket after his body surfaced downriver. His skull had been fractured. The coroner called it an accident. The river had been high, he said, but tell me, what river fractures a skull so cleanly? Even the law tried once. Deputy Samuels, one of the men who had first visited the cabin after Elias Turner's disappearance, began to keep his own notes. He wrote down what the brothers had said, what they had eaten, who had last been seen near their land. His notebook survives, barely, singed at the edges, discovered in a trunk decades later. The final entry reads, "Smoke again, midnight, something screams." Samuels was gone within the week. Official record transferred west. Reality vanished without trace. And so you see, the silence was not passive. It was active. It did not merely ignore the truth, it consumed it. Anyone who pushed too close was removed, erased, folded into the same ash pit as the others. That is why history has so little to give us now, because every witness was either silenced or made to look insane. This is the design. This is not unique to Missouri. This is how every forbidden system operates. When a man speaks too boldly, he is made an example. When an investigator steps too far, he is reassigned, disgraced, or destroyed. When a priest questions too loudly, his sermons vanish, his body with them. The system cannot survive exposure, so it devours the exposers. The lesson here is not just about two brothers, it is about the machinery of concealment. The prey are not only travelers and drifters, the prey are also those who try to reveal the truth. That is why forbidden history feels so thin, so fractured, because what survives are not full testimonies but scraps, letters half-burned, notebooks with missing pages, stories passed in whispers. The rest has been consumed. And yet, these scraps remain. They survived for a reason. They survived because truth has a way of resisting erasure. It clings to the world like smoke clings to lungs. You can silence a man, you can bury his bones, but you cannot kill the echoes of what he saw. Reverend Collier, Morton, Samuels, they were swallowed by silence, but their fragments survive to remind us, the closer you walk to the fire, the more likely it is to reach for you. And now you are walking closer. Power is never sustained by violence alone. Violence sparks the fire, yes, but it is fear. ritualized and taught, that keeps it burning across generations. The brothers understood this instinctively, but more importantly, the community around them enforced it. Fear became culture. Silence became inheritance. Think of the families living within miles of that cabin. Every parent knew the whispers. Every child heard them in fragments at the dinner table. But rather than confront the danger, families adjusted. They folded fear into daily life the way they folded bread or milk. Rules were written without ink. Don't travel that road after sundown. Don't go near the creek. Don't speak the brothers' names aloud. These weren't laws. They were survival codes. Children grew up with these warnings carved into them. To disobey wasn't just dangerous, it was unthinkable. In this way, terror replicated itself. The brothers didn't need to hunt every night. They didn't need to kill constantly. Their reputation did the work for them. Families themselves became the enforcers, training their young not to resist, but to obey. This is the secret of control. Once fear is normalized, it no longer requires active violence. The system sustains itself. The people police their own thoughts, their own movements, their own speech. The predator no longer needs to strike. The prey cages itself. Consider the oral fragments we have from later generations. Old men recalled that when they were children, mothers would hush them if they even pointed toward the brothers' land. Some swore that farmers passed by the cabin without turning their heads, as if even a glance might invite judgment. Imagine the power it takes for two nameless men to bend an entire county into this ritual of silence. And here is the deeper corruption. Silence becomes loyalty. Families began to treat avoidance not just as safety, but as duty. To speak against the brothers would be to endanger everyone. Better to remain quiet. Better to let the predators feast, as long as it was not your blood on their table. That is how evil thrives, not by the strength of the killer, but by the surrender of the crowd. What we see in Missouri is not unique. Every community has its silences. Every society has its rituals of obedience. Some are about race, others about money, others about power hidden in courts or pulpits. The lesson is always the same. Once fear becomes culture, resistance becomes betrayal, and betrayal is punished. Ask yourself, what silences have you inherited? What subjects were you told never to question? Which truths are buried so deeply in your family, your town, your nation, that to speak them aloud feels dangerous? Those are the modern equivalents of the Missouri cabin. Those are the borders marked not by fences, but by fear. This is why the brothers' story still matters. It reveals how easily a community can become complicit. Not by celebrating violence, not by joining in, but by teaching the next generation to look away. That is how predators last, not just for years, but for decades. The cabin burned, the brothers vanished, but their true legacy was not in the bones they left behind. It was in the silence they planted, silence that echoed in families long after the killers were gone. That silence is the real inheritance. That silence is the real crime. And silence, once accepted, never dies on its own. It must be broken. If Missouri in 1908 teaches us anything, it is this: silence never stays local. It spreads, like smoke through rafters, like rot through timber. What happened in that cabin was not just a rural crime. It was a reflection of the way America itself managed power at the turn of the century. And if you think it stopped there, you are deceiving yourself. Consider the timing. The nation was transforming. Railroads cut through wilderness, banks swallowed small farms, industries rose like fortresses of steel, and in every corner of the country, certain people were erased in the process. Migrant workers vanished, union leaders disappeared, families were displaced, native communities were silenced forever. Always the story was the same: someone gained, someone vanished, and the record remained quiet. Missouri was not the exception, it was the blueprint. The brothers were crude instruments, yes, but they mirrored the same pattern carried out by polished institutions. They lured the expendable, consumed them, and left no grave. Replaced the cabin with a factory, replaced the knife with a contract, replaced the fire pit with a ledger. The mechanism does not change, flesh is still burned, futures are still devoured, and silence is still enforced by those who benefit. This is why the story of Missouri could never be told in its full truth, because to admit that 2 killers thrived under official silence would invite a darker question. How many more thrive today under systems dressed in law? If one cabin can erase a handful of men, what can a government erase? What can an economy erase? What can an empire erase while its people tell themselves they are free? Understand, this descent you are on is not just about curiosity, it is about recognition. Once you see the brothers for what they were, agents of a larger order, you begin to see the pattern everywhere. The missing names in history, books, the erased testimonies, the statistics that flatten thousands of deaths into a single number. These are the modern cabins, scattered everywhere, each with its own fire pit. Pause here. Feel the weight of this knowledge. If you've stayed with me this long, you already sense that this is not entertainment. It is initiation. You have been walking deeper, step by step, into forbidden ground. Now prove your descent. Subscribe to this channel and comment below. I see the pattern. I will not look away. Write it twice. Make it a scar on the record, one that cannot be erased. Because history is not written in books, it is written in silence. And every time a man speaks against that silence, he rips the veil open. That is what we are doing here, tearing open a veil that was never meant to be touched. The brothers in Missouri are long dead. Their bones are dust. But the structure that allowed them to thrive, that silence, still lives. It hides in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in pulpits, in speeches that promise one thing while delivering another. It hides behind patriotism, behind religion, behind the mask of progress. Do you see it now? Missouri was not the story. Missouri was the warning, a microcosm of the larger machine, and that machine is still turning, still feeding, still erasing. The question is not whether it exists, the question is whether you are willing to see it. The brothers killed with knives and fire, but the machine that protected them killed with silence, and silence, when practiced long enough, becomes erasure. Erasure is not absence, it is architecture. It is a weapon sharpened by institutions to control not only bodies but memory itself. Look at Missouri. Bones were found, letters were written, witnesses spoke. Yet in every case the record dissolved, files misplaced, testimonies discredited, newspapers printing only fragments. That pattern is not chaos, it is order. It reveals a truth no one wants to face. Forgetting is organized, forgetting is engineered. Ask yourself, who benefits when memory is destroyed? Who gains when stories vanish, when the dead are unnamed, when the crimes of the powerful are never written down? The answer is simple. The predator lives forever when the victim is forgotten. The brothers understood this instinctively. They left no graves. They burned remains, scattered ashes, mocked the very idea of remembrance. They knew that without memory there is no justice, only silence. But the larger system went further. It erased not just bones, but context. It reframed the disappearances as accidents, wanderers lost to the elements, men who simply moved on. In this way, the killings were swallowed into normality. No scandal, no outrage, just life, continuing as if nothing happened. That is the true genius of institutional erasure. It doesn't just hide the crime, it makes the crime invisible, unimaginable, unthinkable. This weaponization of forgetting is not limited to Missouri. It is the lifeblood of every empire. Think of the histories you were never taught in school, the massacres unnamed, the famines explained as natural, the wars stripped of their blood and rewritten as progress. This is not ignorance, this is design. To control a man, you do not have to chain his body, you only have to chain his memory. The community around the brothers absorbed this lesson. Families taught their children not just to avoid the cabin, but to avoid the story itself. Don't talk about it, don't even think about it. Silence became safety, and safety became tradition. By the time decades had passed, the story itself felt like myth, and myth is easier to dismiss. This is how erasure triumphs. The truth becomes a ghost, and men laugh at ghosts. And yet, fragments survive, bones that refuse to burn, letters that escape the fire, oral histories whispered despite punishment. These fragments are dangerous because they resist erasure. They are reminders that memory is the first battlefield of power. That is why every regime rewrites its textbooks. That is why every government buries files under classified. That is why every predator insists the past is gone. Because if the past is remembered, then the crime is exposed. You must grasp this. What the brothers practiced with knives, the system perfected with ledgers. Both consumed men, both left nothing behind, and both relied on the obedience of those who chose forgetting over confrontation. This is why forbidden history matters, because once you see erasure for what it is, you begin to see the same pattern in your own life. The scandals no one speaks of, the names you were never taught, the silences you inherited as if they were truths. Those silences are not empty, they are filled with bodies. Missouri's ash pits were never cleaned, they were simply renamed. And every silence you accept is another pit, dug and waiting. The brothers' cabin was only one room, one fire, one trap, but the structure that sheltered them, the silence that protected them, did not stay small. It grew, it learned, it scaled. What you see in Missouri in 1908 was the prototype of something far larger, a system of managed perception, where truth itself is rationed and reality is written by those who profit from obedience. Think carefully. The sheriff did not investigate. The judge did not prosecute. The newspapers printed only fragments. Already, that is a chain. But chains are meant to be replicated. In time, this method of selective blindness spread far beyond Missouri. By the early 20th century, America was learning to refine silence into industry. The newspapers discovered it first. They realized a crime could be buried not by ignoring it, but by reframing it. If a peddler vanished, the story was not murder, it was wanderer lost. If bones appeared in an ash pit, it was not evidence, it was animal remains. In this way, truth was not denied, it was diluted, and a diluted truth is more effective than a lie, because it leaves just enough uncertainty to disarm outrage. Then the courts refined the art. They learned to control testimony, to discredit witnesses, to label survivors insane. Think of how many crimes across history are buried not because there was no evidence, but because the evidence was declared inadmissible, unreliable, irrelevant. That is the judicial erasure, the transformation of fact into nothingness. And finally, the state perfected it. Records sealed. Files burned in accidental fires, archives redacted. By mid-century, silence was no longer accidental or local. It was systemic, it was bureaucratic, it was national policy. The lesson is brutal. Cabins like the brothers no longer need to exist when you have media to shape perception and laws to rewrite memory. The predator becomes harder to see, but more powerful than ever. He no longer sits by a fire, he sits in offices, he writes decrees, he manages the story itself. And here is the forbidden truth. Managed perception is cannibalism on a grand scale. Instead of flesh, it consumes your sense of reality. Instead of bones, it leaves behind archives so gutted you can no longer reconstruct what happened. The body disappears, but so does the truth. And without truth, obedience becomes natural. Does this sound abstract? Then bring it back to Missouri. Imagine standing in that cabin. Imagine the knife, the fire, the bones. Now imagine the same scene dressed in polished language. Public safety, economic progress, classified information. Do you see it? Different words, same machinery. The fire still burns, the bones are still fed upon, the silence is still law. This is why the brothers' story feels so dangerous. Not because of what two men did, but because it exposes the structure behind them, a structure that scaled, a structure that learned, a structure that now consumes on a level they could never have dreamed. So ask yourself, how much of what you believe about your own history, your own country, your own present reality is truth? And how much has been carefully managed, diluted, reframed? If Missouri was the prototype, then today is the product, and you are living inside it. Not every man who glimpsed the brothers' shadow stayed silent. A few, very few, saw the pattern for what it was and tried to resist, but resistance carried a price, and most who attempted it were broken. This is the most brutal truth of forbidden history. Knowledge itself is dangerous. It changes a man forever, but it does not guarantee survival. In Missouri, there are stories of farmers who spoke too loudly after finding bones near their land. Within months, their crops failed mysteriously, their livestock vanished, their families left destitute. Coincidence? Or punishment delivered by a system that knew how to grind down anyone who threatened its silence? There are letters, fragmentary, half-burned, that describe men falling into despair after realizing what was happening. One trapper wrote, "If the law will not stop them, then nothing will. I have seen their smoke and heard their voices in my dreams. I cannot sleep." Weeks later, he hanged himself in his barn. Another man confessed in private to a neighbor that he had been offered stew in the cabin but managed to escape. He never spoke again, living out his days mute, a ghost among the living. This is the psychological warfare of predators. They do not only feed on flesh, they feed on hope. They teach men that resistance is suicide, that speech is madness, that silence is the only survival. And once a man accepts that bargain, he is no longer alive in the truest sense. He exists, yes, but he is already consumed. But there were others. A handful of men who chose rebellion. They carried rifles. They whispered plans of burning the cabin, of ambushing the brothers in the night. Yet somehow those plans never materialized. Some claim the sheriff warned them off. Others say their courage failed when the moment came. The few who did act, striking in secret, sabotaging tools, spreading warnings, were erased from record. One M.A., Anne, remembered only as John Carter, was rumored to have shot at one of the brothers in the dark. Days later, his body was found hanging from a tree, staged as suicide. And so we see the dilemma that defines every age of forbidden knowledge. When a man sees the machinery, he stands at a crossroads. One path leads to despair, where the weight of truth crushes him into silence or madness. The other path leads to rebellion, where he risks destruction at the hands of the very system he opposes. Both paths end in blood. Both paths end in loss. But there is a third path. It is the path we are walking now, the path of recognition. To speak, to remember, to resist erasure not by bullets, but by breaking silence itself. The brothers are dead. The cabin is ash. But the pattern they embodied lives on, and every time we name it, every time we refuse to look away, we weaken its hold. This is what makes knowledge dangerous. It does not protect you. It does not guarantee victory, but it transforms you. Once you see the machinery, you are no longer prey in the same way. You may still be hunted, yes, but you are awake. And an awake man, even in chains, is harder to consume. Missouri taught men despair, but it also left fragments of rebellion, enough for us to remember that silence is not the only option. The cabin was burned, but the smoke it left behind still lingers, and if you breathe it deeply, you cannot remain the same. Every predator eventually vanishes, but the question is never if, it is how. Did the brothers die in fire? Were they hanged in secret, or did they simply melt into the countryside, their names erased as efficiently as their victims? The record refuses to answer, and that refusal is itself the answer. The official version, repeated in fragments decades later, is that vigilantes burned the cabin one night while the brothers slept. But there are no names, no dates, no witnesses who admitted it openly. Only whispers, smoke rising over the valley, flames consuming timber, screams carried by the wind. And yet, if such an act occurred, where are the bodies? Where are the bones? Where is the proof? None exists. Only ash. Ash that could have come from wood alone. Another version insists they were arrested quietly, tried behind closed doors, and executed in secrecy to avoid scandal. Again, no records, no gallows, no graves, just silence. The courthouse in that county suffered a fire in 1912, consuming many files. Convenient, isn't it? A third account, more chilling still, claims the brothers did not die at all, that they fled Missouri, vanished into neighboring states, and continued their work under new names. Travelers in Arkansas and Oklahoma reported similar disappearances, cabins with similar smoke, faces that resembled descriptions. Were these coincidences? Or did the predators simply migrate, protected by the same silence that had always shielded them? The truth is impossible to pin down, and that impossibility is not accident, it is design. The brothers' fate was erased with the same precision as their crimes. By leaving their end uncertain, the system ensured no closure, no justice, no resolution. Instead, the story became myth. detached from evidence, floating in rumor, easy to dismiss. Just tales, they say now, just legends. But legends do not grow from nothing. Legends sprout from bones. And here lies the darkest twist. The brothers' disappearance may have been the final act of control. To erase not only the victims, but the killers themselves, is to erase the entire ledger. Without victims and without perpetrators, nothing remains but silence. And silence is the most useful outcome of all. But silence is never total. The land remembers. Locals still speak of certain nights when the air carries a strange odor, when dogs bark without reason, when the wind shifts as if carrying old screams. Children dare each other to walk the ruins of the cabin's foundation. Some say the earth there feels scorched, barren, unwilling to grow. Others claim they have seen shapes in the tree line, watching, waiting. What is more frightening? That the brothers died unpunished, or that they never died at all. Either way, the effect is the same. Fear remains, and fear, as you now understand, is the real inheritance. This is how the system closes its stories. Not with justice, not with truth, but with ambiguity. Because ambiguity paralyzes. It leaves men arguing over details instead of recognizing the larger machinery. It reduces history to rumor, so no one takes action. That is the camouflage. That is the trap. The brother's end is a mirror. You are not meant to know, you are meant to doubt, and in your doubt, you are meant to obey. The cabin is gone. The brothers are ash, rumor, or dust on someone else's road. Yet their shadow remains because their story was never about two men. It was about the machine. Missouri was a stage, a rehearsal, a local mask on a pattern as old as power itself. And now, after 17 descents, you see it clearly. The predator, the enforcer, the silence, the erasure, the utility. It was never accident. It was design. The question is not whether the brothers lived or died. The question is why their story looks the same as every forbidden chapter in history. The pattern repeats because the pattern works. Fear creates obedience. Silence protects power. Memory is burned. Truth is diluted, and the machine keeps turning. Kings called it divine right. Priests called it sacrifice. Politicians call it order. Corporations call it efficiency. Different masks. Same hunger. And if you've stayed with me until now, you are no longer audience. You are participant. You have walked the road to the cabin. You have stood at the door. You have breathed the smoke. You have seen how two nameless men became mirrors of something larger, something that still hunts today. The real danger is not that you heard their story. The real danger is that now you see through the camouflage around you. This is where I tell you to make a choice. You can forget this. Let the smoke clear and return to the comfort of silence. That path is easy. That path is safe. Or you can choose to descend fully, to seal yourself into awareness, to refuse erasure. That path is dangerous. That path changes you forever. If you choose descent, make it real. Subscribe right now and comment below. I descend, I awaken. Write it twice. Mark yourself in the record, not as prey, not as victim, but as one who sees. This is not entertainment. This is ritual. This is the scar that separates you from the silence. Because here is the truth you were never meant to hear. The cabin was only one altar. There are thousands more. They may not burn bodies, but they burn lives. They may not hang bones on walls, but they hang names on debts. They may not serve stew, but they serve promises that taste the same, sweet at first, bitter at the end. The ritual never ended, it only changed costumes. And once you know this, you cannot unknow it. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You will look at courts, at pulpits, at governments, at corporations, and you will see the predator smiling, the enforcer staring, the silence swallowing everything in between. That knowledge is heavy, that knowledge is dangerous, but that knowledge is power. So take it, carry it, let it sharpen you, because the only men who remain prey are those who never realize they are hunted, and you have realized. That is the descent, that is the awakening. The Missouri brothers were not the end of a story, they were the prologue. The machine still feeds, The smoke still rises, the silence still commands, but now you are no longer blind. Remember this: silence is obedience, memory is rebellion, and dissent is freedom.